Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. I'm Katie Nichols. I'm a SANS instructor for Forensics 578, as well as Director of Intelligence Operations for Red Canary. And wow, it has been a busy month for threats and for anyone who is tracking all of these threats. If you've joined the live stream before, sometimes we'll have guests, but today, actually just going to walk through the many threat reports, all of the stuff that's happening. I will admit it has been tough for me to even keep up with it. And this is kind of what I do, but hopefully talk about some of these themes, things you might have heard, and think about, as always, right, what are the implications for us as cybersecurity analysts, CTI researchers, etc. All right, so let's dive in. I've got lots and lots of things to share. Let's start with everyone's favorite hot 0-day summer. So this is sort of a joke on social media, whatever social media platform you're on now. A lot of vulnerabilities this summer. And I would argue that, yes, there are a lot of vulnerabilities all the time, but we've seen a couple of prevalent ones. As you've heard me say before, if you've joined the live stream, right, vulnerabilities happen in code. Really important questions that I think we all need to ask ourselves when we see people panicking about cold fusion vulnerabilities, Citrix vulnerabilities. First off, go to trusted sources, right? And we'll share in the chat some different trusted sources. One org that I really trust, Gray Noise, they have for free tracking of different vulnerabilities they have visibility on, right? So whenever there's a new vulnerability that comes out, for example, the Citrix, ADC, and NetScaler vulnerabilities, right? They will actually track, okay, how many attempted scans or exploits are we seeing for this vulnerability? That's one great source, right? Which can give you a sense of, I think, the first big question for any vulnerability, is it being exploited in the wild, right? But not just is it being exploited in the wild, how prevalent is that exploitation? And that's where a source like Gray Noise or others can be really helpful, right? There's a huge difference if a vulnerability has been exploited to target a single organization by some state-sponsored actor versus everyone, all of the adversaries are scanning and exploiting it. So that's the first big thing, right? Think about how widely is it being exploited and what are the details of that exploitation, right? It's really tough sometimes. Some of you probably feel this who are on the detection and response side. Like, we all want to know, cool, how exactly are adversaries exploiting this NetScaler vulnerability? And why that matters is it's not enough to know just, okay, it's being exploited in the wilds. If you don't know how that's happening, it can be really tough to know how do we as analysts try to detect it, right? So the most fundamental question, though, for any vulnerability is, does this actually affect us, right? I see a lot of people, it's 0-day summer, right? We all want to freak out about the 0 days. But for these examples, if you don't have any Citrix appliances, if you don't use Adobe Cold Fusion, like maybe you don't need to panic as much about these. Of course, we have to think about, do we have connections to other orgs who use those? But, right, something to be cautious of. So vulnerabilities, figure out if you have the software, figure out, is it being exploited in the wild? How broadly is it being exploited? And then the details of exploitation, right? So for this example, there were actually 3 vulnerabilities, I believe, in Citrix appliances. Now I think they're called NetScaler, right? Formerly Citrix. A lot of people are calling them Citrix. So super exciting when after these vulnerabilities were released, CISA actually released this report on the details of the exploitation, right? Why this is so helpful is, again, that if we don't know how they're exploited, it's really tough for us to know what to look for. Like, cool, just go look for your Citrix appliance to see if there's signs of exploitation. Tough to know. So helpfully, CISA released this report. And I will say, if anyone from CISA is watching, really detailed report. Right? As many of you know, I used to be on the MITRE ATT&CK team. Love that people map to MITRE ATT&CK. Some people stop at the technique level. Not my favorite. You've got to know the procedures, right? Exactly what are the details of what happened. And right, CISA not only mapped to MITRE ATT&CK, but gave the specific details. They viewed these specific configuration files, right? Queried Active Directory via LDAP search. What exactly did they query for? So lots of details in here. The important thing to remember, though, if you have Citrix appliances, a lot of people think, okay, cool, they're using these attack techniques. Like most of my security monitoring would catch this. Not necessarily, right? The challenge, and this is pointed out at the bottom of the CISA report past all the beautiful MITRE attack tables, right? You actually need to log on, in this example, to ADC, that Citrix appliance, and use their shell interface to look for if that appliance has been compromised. There's probably an exception somewhere, but I will say by and large, endpoint sensors don't usually run on these appliances. And so if you're like, cool, no problem, like our existing network monitoring will probably catch this, it might not, right? Where you might catch something is if adversaries try to move from the Citrix appliance to the rest of your network. But you obviously want to try to catch it a little earlier. So if you have a Citrix appliance, these are great suggestions from CISA going in, running these checks, like trying to do some investigation. Is my Citrix completely pwned? And then, of course, to state the obvious, if you have a vulnerable appliance, you definitely want to follow the vendor's recommendations for updating it. So vulnerabilities, scary. Don't worry, you can patch against them. Most of the time you can investigate, etc. So Citrix one, I know that there's been increased adversary interest in this one. It's always nice to have multiple sources, right? Multiple sources of information about whatever exploitation's happening. So also Mandiant blog post. We're going to talk about a lot of Mandiant blogs today. Anyone at Mandiant, like, I don't know how y'all do it, but you're pumping out blogs like it is your job. And I imagine you have many jobs, but this one was helpful. Talked about, again, what exactly did adversaries do during the exploitation? Because it's not really enough to know, cool, it's exploited in the wild. What did they do? So again, if you have Citrix appliances, take a look at these resources. A lot of things you can look for, and some great Mandiant malware names as always. So that is on the Citrix vulnerability side. There have been so many that can't even list them all, right? Others in Cold Fusion. It seems like every day there's a new vulnerability. But again, remember, do we have the software that's affected? Is it being exploited in the wild? How is it being exploited? And really thinking about, do you have the right telemetry? And where do you need to look? Is it endpoint? Is it network? Is it on that perimeter appliance itself? So late breaking one, I just saw this shared by Maddie Stone like 20 minutes before we started streaming here. So new report out from the awesome team at Google on a review of 0 days from last year exploited in the wild. So always fun when we get year in review reports, looking at patterns, looking at trends. I think this is helpful because it also helps us as analysts and humans hedge against some of our mental biases maybe on, oh my gosh, there's so many 0 days, like it's really scary. So you can see in the summary, 41 0 days detected, disclosed in 2022, second most ever, but it was down from 2021, the previous year. Hey, maybe that's good. But in this post by Maddie talking about some of the kind of key takeaways, some of the challenges with Android, some of the so-called zero-click exploits. So late breaking one, but always nice to look at trends over the years, right? Remembering the numbers don't always tell the story, full story that is, but something we can look at. So breakdown by platform, probably not a shock to everyone. Like Windows is leading, not a race that anyone really wants to win, but in terms of in the wild 0 days, Windows leading. But hey, there are vulnerabilities in Mac OS as well, Android, iOS, etc. So definitely worth checking that one out as well, especially if you are the type of person who's scared about 0 days. Look at some trends. Vulnerabilities happen. They're reality of life, right? Respond to them, patch them, and just know how adversaries are exploiting them, right? That's the key message on vulnerabilities. So don't fear. There are going to be more vulnerabilities. It's hot 0 day summer. So for the next one, don't panic. Just think about how you might be able to detect that exploitation. That's the key. Yep, and someone mentioning CVSS scores. Yes, CVSS scores also really helpful in prioritizing those vulnerabilities. Still, though, as an analyst, I want more details, right? Might say, is it being exploited in the wild? But I want to know the details. So I'm very greedy in that. All right, vulnerability is not the only thing happening, right? Lots of other things happening as well. Moving over to this blog post from Microsoft. Cryptojacking. So this is a really interesting area because I found so many adversaries are doing crypto mining, like stealing resources to mine cryptocurrency. But a lot of people sort of ignore it. Why I think that might not be the best approach is that sometimes, right, if there are crypto miners, that means that there's something wrong in that system. Maybe you haven't added proper authentication, multi-factor, etc. Right? So think about if you have crypto miners on a system, it's a sign of usually bad hygiene. And it might be a nice thing because then you can deal with the crypto miner, right? Rather than deal with some kind of more advanced intrusion. So my personal recommendation, we see a lot of people who are like, crypto miners, whatever. They're just, using my system resources, but sign of bad hygiene. Also, they can cost you a lot, right? That's one thing that Microsoft points out here. Targeted orgs incurred more than $300,000 in compute fees due to these cryptojacking attacks. So if you don't care about anything else, I'm going to imagine every organization cares about not losing money. So this blog post was awesome because it really dives into the details about how this mining happens, right? And if you are new to the cloud world, which I think we're all newer to the cloud world, the nice thing is you can still think of the overall attack chain, right? The life cycle, the stages that adversaries go through. As always, I really appreciate the Microsoft graphics. Okay, adversaries get into the cloud environment, but then they take some other actions, right? And my takeaway from this is thinking about, right, as you're monitoring cloud environments, could you look for these anomalies, right? For example, adversaries, if your core quotas are low, right? If your cloud environment doesn't have the resources they want, like more computing power means more cryptocurrency mined, they'll increase them, right? And maybe you could go in and look at, all right, if an adversary is changing my instances to N series, for example, a specific type of GPU core, could that be suspicious in my environment? If that's not something that usually happens in your cloud environment, maybe worth looking at, right? Or mass creating resources. If creating a whole bunch of new instances in your cloud isn't normal in your environment, that could be another thing to look at. So a lot of good detail here. Again, a lot of people have found that maybe our monitoring and understanding of the cloud environments isn't as good as on-premise, traditional endpoint and network monitoring we've been doing for decades. So I think it's always good to know your gaps, know where maybe you have a little more learning to do, and keeping an eye out for blog posts like this, understanding what are the things adversaries are doing. It's still steps of an intrusion chain, but how you detect them, right? How you think about those actions are just a little bit different. So taking a look more holistically, I always like knowing the impact of all of these breaches, all these incidents that we face. New report out from IBM, Cost of a Data Breach, 2023 report. This is helpful to me because I don't know about you, if I can justify to my bosses, like, hey, we might have just saved you a whole bunch of money by preventing this breach, like that kind of justifies your team existing, right? So a couple of key findings, key numbers from this report. Average cost of a breach, right? $4.4 million, $5 million to be precise. Of course, every data set's limited, but they have a pretty big data set here. And looking at that, that is a huge amount of money. It is always tough. Like, I don't envy anyone who does high-level leadership budgeting. But if you're looking at, do you spend a couple $100,000 to hire a few security people or set up, security program versus $4.45 million, might be an important thing to look at. So the other interesting thing here, 51% of orgs planning to increase security investments as a result of a breach. This is something that myself and others, I think, across the community have seen, that once organizations have experienced a really terrible breach, they up their game in security. And it's kind of sad, right? We're all, we're security professionals. We like to preach, hey, the importance of proactive monitoring, right? Getting a good security monitoring program before you get breached. Doesn't always happen, right? So after they're breached, a lot of orgs are like, oh man, we need to really up our security investments. So that was kind of an interesting finding. Other impacts, of course, everyone's looking at AI, so that could be something to look at, right? A couple other things to highlight. Somewhere in here, there was talk of cloud, right? Cloud intrusions, cloud incidents. See if I can find it for you. A lot of breaches are happening in the cloud, right? That's the reality. Here it is, 82%. Scroll in on it for you, and you can check it out from the link. 82% of breaches involve data stored in the cloud. That's a lot. And you could even think like, are there other breaches that they don't know if data stored in the cloud was involved? That's huge. And again, to our last report on knowing how cryptojacking occurs, right? Knowing what's happening in those cloud environments, how adversaries are operating, pretty important. The other takeaway here, adversaries gaining access to multiple environments, 39% of breaches spanning multiple environments, right? We see increasingly adversaries moving from on-premise to SaaS, to cloud infrastructure, to, I don't know, Kubernetes, back and forth. And I think that we as defenders maybe are a little slower than the adversaries sometimes to get good at pivoting between these different sources across cloud, across on-premise environments. So great report, tons and tons of insights here. Take a look at this one, especially if maybe you're trying to make the case for, why it's worth investing in a security program. Not always an easy case to make, but I think this report from IBM can show, right, some of the patterns in data breaches. So that's a great one to check out. Another roll-up report, and it's so fun. I love the annual reports, and these, if anyone's done one, they take a lot of time to put together, but it's so cool because, right, IBM looks at data breaches, VirusTotal has a lot of malware that they look at. This was a neat report talking about what are the most common malware formats, delivery techniques that VirusTotal has seen in their massive, massive data set of malware. A couple things are surprising here. So some things not so surprising, like email, still used to spread malware. Yes, that makes sense. A couple things that stuck out to me, OneNote attachments in particular, and then links that led to OneNote. We saw sort of an early surge in this early 2023. So those still pretty prevalent in VirusTotal's malware corpus. Good news is OneNote, malicious activity spawning from OneNote, there are a couple simple things you can do, right? Looking for weird process lineage, like should PowerShell be coming from OneNote? So as always, as you're reading these reports, I think it's good for every org to be thinking about what can you action out of this, right? Okay, OneNote. Would we detect weird OneNote execution? Other things, traditional file types, Excel becoming less popular. It's a little sad, but maybe not so much. So much Excel-based malware in the past. But interestingly, one file format that is still popular, PDFs. It's decreased a little bit, but still really prevalent. This is consistent with what I've seen as well. A lot of different adversaries still use PDF formats, so don't overlook some of these older formats as well. Another file type to pay attention to, ISO files. SANS uses ISO files to distribute course materials, right? They're really helpful, distribute a lot of data at once. But part of the fact that how they work, right? Often they're distributed as compressed, take up less space. That bypasses a lot of scanning from maybe your email gateway appliance. Adversaries know kind of how we defend, how our tools work. And so ISOs, still a file type that I know my team has seen pretty frequently being used. So again, thinking about, cool, how could we detect this? Sometimes it's confusing because when a victim mounts or clicks on an ISO file, it looks like a thumb drive, like it has maybe E drive name. So just knowing how would this look in our logs, how would these ISO files look if there was malicious execution there? And not a shock here, adversaries like to masquerade, right? They like to pretend that they're legitimate software, Telegram, AnyDesk. I know my team has seen a lot of ChatGPT masquerading, right? Everyone's so curious about AI. Let's download all the AI. Gaming software is another one. We sometimes joke that like a really good security investment would be to give employees like a video game budget, and then they don't go search for video games and do sketchy downloads. So if you care about malware, this is a great read. Again, thinking about the trends, right? Maybe you have opportunities. How would we look at weird ISO execution, for example? But the good news is if you're looking for malicious PDF activity, still helpful, right? That is still something adversaries are doing. Cool. So comments coming in. Appreciate someone commenting. Your personnel, right? Your people are your first line of defense. Absolutely. And I think that's part of the takeaway here in the masquerading, right? Telling users, hey, a lot of these things, right? If you're searching for software on the internet and it's free, it's often too good to be true. So users not forgetting them as well as we think about the actionable takeaways. All right. Onward and upward to our next topic. No shortage of topics to discuss here. Jump Cloud. So Jump Cloud, product used for identity management access, etc. Recently had a security incident. So again, this is one that was really big in the news. People are like, oh my gosh, Jump Cloud compromise, panic. First question, do you use Jump Cloud in your environment? I know that finding an asset inventory is really, really hard, right? Keeping an up-to-date network map, not super easy. But the good news is sometimes if you go to your finance people, right? Finance people might be a great source of what software you actually have, you're paying for. So just a hint if asset inventory is tough for you. So if you're like Jump Cloud, everyone's panicking about this compromise, go to your finance people, ask them, do we use Jump Cloud? So Jump Cloud got compromised, as organizations do. It happens. I appreciate any org who shares information. And Jump Cloud not only shared some details, they also shared indicators, which is exciting. Then we have something we can look for if we are concerned. In terms of the impact, fewer than 5 customers impacted 10 total devices. So good to know that. Again, thinking about the scope of anything like this. And I confirmed everyone cares about attribution, of course. Not going to rant about attribution today, but I would say probably need to be worried about malicious activity regardless of who is behind the keyboard. Sometimes it does matter. And in this case, they were able to attribute it to North Korea. So in addition to CrowdStrike investigating this, making that assessment, right, Mandiant also put out a blog post on this, supporting that assessment that it's likely North Korean actors. And again, this one made headlines, supply chain attack. In addition to 0 days, that's one of the things that our community likes to panic about a lot. But again, whenever there's a supply chain attack, you always want to think about, is this in my threat model? Okay, am I a Jump Cloud customer? If so, yes, you need to be very concerned about this. If not, less concerned, but maybe it's still worth reading this, understanding how this group operates, right? How maybe if they compromised another third party you were connected to, how that might appear in your network. So another great blog post from the folks at Mandiant attributed this to UNC 4899, North Korean actors, and talking about the overview. I like a good graphic, right? Spear phishing, that's how the Jump Cloud was initially compromised, tying back to our last discussion on common email formats, phishing formats used, right? Then moving from the Jump Cloud environment into the customer environment. This is not the first time this type of attack has happened, but it's something that we have to continue watching for. It's not easy. And I've found that for any type of supply chain attack like this, sometimes analysts are the ones who sort of make it a challenge to investigate, because I don't know about you, if I'm looking at, some weird process execution, cool, that comes from Jump Cloud. I know Jump Cloud, that's something we legitimately have, software we have in our environment. As an analyst, I'm a lot more likely to just overlook that, right? So part of educating your analysts is question everything, right? Just because it's a legit tool, legit process, doesn't mean that it couldn't be compromised, right? We've seen this with all kinds of intrusions, Kaseya a couple of years ago, etc. So lots of details in here about how the malware executed in that customer environment. Mandiant has great malware names. I really like Stratofear, kind of a strong malware name in here. So taking a look at the host artifacts, this is also interesting and is a good read because the adversary targeted OS X machines. So yes, Mac machines can get compromised. It happens. I know, mind blown. Sorry, anyone from Apple who's watching. As we saw in the kind of 0-day patterns earlier in Maddie's blog post, yes, there were fewer 0 days in macOS systems, but macOS compromises do happen. OS X compromises do happen. And so if you have OS X machines in your environment, this is a good post to read because I find it's a little bit rarer that we get insights in the wild into what's happening in these OS X intrusions. So thinking about, okay, maybe we're not a jump cloud customer this time, but if something similar happened in the future, right, could we look for similar behaviors? So this is a great one if you have OS X environments, or if you just want to learn more about how adversaries operate in those intrusions, or if this North Korean actor is in your threat model is of concern to you. All right. So that is Jump Cloud. That's been one of the big incidents in the news lately. Moving on to some others, let's talk a little bit about what's been going on with Microsoft 365, with Outlook, etc. So series of things happening here, and it's been confusing for me. I don't know about you all, but there have been a few reports from CISA, from Microsoft, about different actors that came out within like a week or two. So pretty darn confusing. But try to separate these in our brain. All right, so let's take the CISA report, right? July 12th, APT group targeting Outlook online. So you probably saw in the news, this made kind of mainstream media. Cybersecurity is making mainstream media news sometimes. A federal government agency, right, identified suspicious environment in their Microsoft 365 cloud environment. Some emails were accessed. There's been reporting about how various federal agencies were affected by this one. And so, as always, appreciate details, thinking about how did this exactly happen. So this walks through, and again, if you're not super familiar with Microsoft 365, this is a nice report to look at, to think about what exactly do we have available in Microsoft 365 audit logs. I will also say that my SANS colleagues, Megan, Roddy, Forensics 509 folks, they've done a lot of great blog posts, YouTube live streams, etc., talking about some of these Microsoft 365 artifacts. It's really sort of a different way of thinking. Again, if you have a cloud environment, if you have Azure, AWS, it's very different than an endpoint. And so this post talks through, right, some of the log types that were useful in investigating this activity. So, for example, mail items accessed. Makes sense. You'd want to know what mail items were accessed, and talks through how these adversaries exfiltrated information. So, interesting piece here, and this is where we get into some of the policy side. A lot of people came out after CISA released this report, right, saying, hey, mail items accessed events are only available if you have certain types of Microsoft subscriptions. I believe it was an E5 subscription. So I would essentially have to pay a little more if I wanted to try to investigate that. So no one knows exactly what happened, but it sounds like some folks from CISA chatted with some folks from Microsoft and said, hey, is there something we could do, be a little bit better to get people the insight, the log access they need to be able to investigate if they had a similar intrusion? So you saw this announcement from Vasuja Kal, someone I'm a big fan of at Microsoft. They announced, yeah, we actually changed the logging that's available for different levels of Microsoft customers, right? Talks about how log data is super important. So basically making a lot of the log sources that you used to have to pay extra for accessible to more Microsoft customers. Awesome. I think it's an awesome step by Microsoft, getting people more access to be able to investigate. However, I think the important thing that I would highlight here is that those log sources, right, having access to them isn't really going to be enough. You need to figure out how to use them, right? So this report, if you download it, take a look, they actually have some specific recommendations. What can you look for, right? Mail items accessed events. Is there a baseline you could set looking for anomalies there? So awesome that there's more logs available. As analysts, now that these are available, if you have Microsoft 365, go in and take a look and think about how you might be able to alert on these. Is there a threshold? Is there something that, right, a certain level you might want to alert on? So interesting example of how CISA, I think, is partnering. Public-private partnerships have been a huge part of their goals this year. Neat example of how log visibility expanded and how that could help in this specific exploitation. So worth looking at. We'll see what else we see in the news about federal agencies affected by this. So definitely worth paying attention to. Again, our jobs are not easy. We have to look at all of these different environments, be versed in lots of different log sources. So it's another one you probably saw in the news that might be interested in looking into further. Another one that's made news. Again, like so many of these things, and like I think I'm keeping them straight in my brain, but a lot happening. So this was a separate incident from Microsoft released some details of. The group is called Storm 0558, right? Unauthorized access. So first published, I think it was early July 11th, right? Microsoft talked about how they mitigated an attack by a China-based actor. It talked about Microsoft mitigated this, and then talked a little bit about how the adversaries did this. They used forged authentication tokens to access user email using an acquired Microsoft account MSA consumer signing key, right? So one of the nuances a lot of people saw in this first report was, right, the adversaries used an acquired MSA consumer signing key. Well, those keys shouldn't be easy to identify. And so a question that a lot of people had was, how did those actors get that key? Right? So take a look at this blog post. Again, as always, thinking about what are the TTPs? What did Storm 0558 do? How did they operate in a cloud environment? This is kind of a neat example. There are many things that analysts use as they try to make an attribution assessment, especially to a country. But one technique analysts can use is basically patterns of life. If you see adversaries kind of operating in a certain range of hours, you might be able to say those are working hours in a certain time zone. Not saying, okay, well, if it's in UTC -8 working hours, it's definitely Chinese actors. But again, it's one piece of evidence analysts can use as they try to build that attribution assessment. As always, thinking about, does this even matter to you, right? Targeted US, European diplomatic, economic governing bodies, right? Connections to Taiwan, Uyghur geopolitical interests. If you fall in that targeting, this is probably a very high priority for you. If not, maybe a lesser priority for you. So, good report to read through. The plot thickens, right? This has gotten interesting. So what happened is a little bit after, right, these blog posts from Microsoft were released, I think it was just last week, Wiz, another awesome security org, released this blog post talking about how that compromised MSA key actually could have a significant impact. And if you are a Microsoft environment, if you use Microsoft services, I think this is worth reading to understand what I would say is a potential risk, right? Talks about how Storm 0558 acquired this MSA key, used it to forge tokens, and it talks about the potential for how else that MSA key could be used to access other Microsoft environments. So a lot of details in here. Talking about the significance, what could be affected. Now, the kind of discussion in the public eye has been over, is the Wiz assessment valid? And you might have seen, on social media, people are talking about this quite a bit, just to kind of share with you the different sides, right? Wiz put out that report. Microsoft then came out saying that, what were the actual words? It was not well-founded, essentially. Maybe not a ton of evidence. Speculative and not evidence-based. One thing I would point out is that anytime we're making an assessment, especially as Intel analysts, we use evidence to make an assessment. A lot of what we're doing isn't factual. And so sometimes people could call that speculative. So I don't know there's a clear answer here. What I would recommend anyone who uses a Microsoft environment, I think it's worth reading that Wiz blog post, understanding what could potentially happen. At the same time, realizing, maybe there's not clear evidence or factual evidence of that yet, but I think it's worth keeping an eye on. So if you've seen kind of some of the discussion of that, that's the gist of it. Some disagreement, but ultimately, I think what's most likely from what I've heard from other researchers, Microsoft's probably still investigating, trying to figure this out. And if you've been involved in a big incident response, you know that that is not the easiest thing to do. So if anyone at Microsoft is working this, good luck. Hats off to them. I think it's worth paying attention to this, seeing how far this incident could go. I don't think that anyone knows for sure yet, but definitely watch this space, watch commentary from Microsoft, seeing if there is more behind this. So again, I like to present, here's what's going on. You form your own opinions based on the evidence that everyone's presented. But definitely worth watching as defenders. All right, we got more. So I don't always do this, but I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple things from the policy perspective. So I think that it's really interesting as cybersecurity practitioners to know what's going on with policy. And I'm going to focus more on US policy, but for folks in other countries, I saw we have someone in India thinking about your country's policies, right? What are decision makers creating in your government? What are the things that they're proposing? How could that affect your organization? And a lot of times, policymakers will open things up for public comment. That's a great opportunity to get involved, to share, hey, as a practitioner, here's something that I think is important. So keeping an eye out for policy as well. So you might have seen a couple of weeks ago, the National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Plan was released. So the National Cybersecurity Strategy came out a couple months ago, and it had kind of a high-level description. Here are the things that the Biden administration wants to focus on in cybersecurity. But this actually had some more details about specific implementations. So if you are curious, this is pretty long, but some of my colleagues over at the Atlantic Council summarized some trends. And then myself and a couple others from the community, you might recognize some of these names, some smart people, like Wendy Nather, many others, Chris Wysopal, one of the original Loft guys. We went through and just marked up, what do we think about these initiatives? So you'll see a lot of themes. Some of them as defenders, I think are kind of exciting. Disrupt and dismantling threat actors. I get excited about that anytime the government's like, yep, let's make adversaries have a really bad day. So that's one's interesting. Shaping market forces. So this is something where, again, governments realize that no one can go this alone, that thinking about asking private sector companies to build in security into their products, to have software bill of materials, SBOMs, things like that. So worth a look, thinking about, what do you think of these initiatives? Do you think these would work in your organization if someone came to you and asked you to implement this or asked you to share information with the government? What do you think? I found that a lot of cybersecurity practitioners are scared to get in the policy side, but the reality is that it's helpful for policymakers to understand what it's like being a cybersecurity professional, right? Providing that feedback. So if you want to dive in, if you're interested in this area, I think it's really interesting to see just what initiatives have been proposed, thinking about how these might affect your team, your organization in the future. On the policy side, another thing, you might have seen this one come out. If you are a public company, definitely ask your leadership, ask your lawyers what's happening with this one. So the SEC has come out with a new rule saying public companies have to disclose breaches within 4 days. When this first came out, my initial thought was, okay, what does that mean? How do you define breach? At what point do you have to report? When does the 4-day clock start? So take a look at the details of this. So essentially what they say is it's a material breach. And I believe lawyers look, but the material definition is if it would impact investor decisions. There's a definition, but even that definition of a material breach, that's a challenge. So this is going to be an interesting one. my interpretation, I'm not a lawyer. This probably doesn't mean if you have a single IDS alert, hey, weird malware, and nothing was stolen, probably don't need to report that. Again, talk to your lawyer. But if you have a significant breach, if you have some extortion, right? Adversaries steal your data and threaten to leak it, probably something that might need to be reported based on this SEC rule if you are a public company. So this is one, talk to your lawyers, right? If you're involved in incident response at all, this might add a new wrinkle of reporting requirements for you. Again, why it matters to keep an eye on what are these policies that are happening, because they really might affect your day-to-day if you are working in a public company. So that's one thing on the policy side. Yeah, Conrad saying the organization defines material breach and then examiners agree or not. There's also an exception, I think, for national security purposes. So interesting. And this is, again, one where make friends with your lawyer. Call your lawyer if you're in doubt. Make sure your organization doesn't get caught up in this. Another interesting one, FCC, Federal Communications Commission. And it's fascinating to me, government bureaucracy, there's a lot there. All these different agencies have different parts in proposing rules. And this was one that caught my eye. The FCC, a new proposal on trying to prevent SIM swapping. So SIM swapping, if you have tracked the group, for example, Scattered Spider / Octopus, you might be familiar with this technique. This is where basically adversaries are saying, maybe they call up an employee of my cell phone company or my cell phone provider, and they say, I'm Katie Nichols, and I lost my phone. Can you transfer my SIM to a new phone? And there are different ways that adversaries can do this. There's reports of sometimes they will actually go into cell phone provider stores, right, get access to those systems and do this SIM swapping. Like that opens up a whole avenue for adversaries to gain access into environments, right? If you have someone's phone, you can get their two-factor authentication codes a lot of the time, right? Gain access into environments. And so SIM swapping, something that is worth paying attention to. The thing that kind of stinks from a cybersecurity professional perspective is that there's not a whole lot you can recommend to organizations to prevent SIM swapping. It's very much something that falls on those providers themselves. And so that's why I thought this rule was pretty interesting, right? These are proposals for rules on making SIM swapping more difficult, burden being on those cell phone providers, the cell service providers to do this. So this is something might be kind of interesting, taking a look at this, what's proposed here, thinking about, is this a good idea? Is this not a good idea? A lot of details in here, taking a look at that. So SIM swapping, kind of an important thing to pay attention to. I also wanted to highlight, if you're not familiar with SIM swapping, something you might want to check out is this video. This is from SleuthCon. So SleuthCon happened a couple months ago. Awesome cybercrime focused conference. This presentation was from Jake Edmandiant, talking about octopus, which is another kind of umbrella term for a bunch of different actors. But one of the many techniques these actors use is SIM swapping for initial access, also SMS phishing. These actors are pretty darn advanced. And so this might be a video worth watching if you want to learn more about SIM swapping, those techniques. There's also a bunch of other awesome videos that are available from SleuthCon as well. So you can check out from that link, the links to all of the other talks. All right, so just talking about a few policy things, right? From the Biden administration, from the SEC, from the FCC, again, with the idea that some of these policies might affect you as cybersecurity professionals, thinking about what those implications should be. All right. Let's close out by talking about a couple of upcoming events. So the SANS DFIR Summit. This is an awesome event. It's in Austin, Texas. It's like a week away. Oh my gosh, time flies. July is almost over. So DFIR Summit, it's in person and live online. And so you can register for free. Just go to that page, register for the online summit. There's so many awesome talks. This is also a really fun one if you can make it in person. This is a very fun event, good networking opportunities. So DFIR Summit coming up next week. That's going to be awesome. And then if you really like to plan ahead, right, another one to look for, the CTI Summit. We've scheduled this. We have the dates. The summit is going to be January 29th and 30th, 2024, next year, in Washington, D.C., and live online. And so again, you can go in and actually sign up for that now. So we haven't opened the call for proposals yet, but I'll certainly be asking for proposals in future months. So those are just two of the summits. There are tons of others. If you are across the pond in the UK, Cyber Threat 2023, that call for presentations is open. So lots of other events, and most of these are live online, totally free to register live online. So if you want to know even more about all of the threats, all the types of things we've talked about today, great resources for you there. All right. Well, that is all I have for you today. A lot going on. Thanks so much for tuning in. As always, please stay well, and we hope to see you at a future live stream. Bye.